Now, I'd like to bring all the speakers back up. Thank you all so much for your illuminating, or should I say dimming, presentations. For those of us familiar with this topic, the four of you really are celebrities, and this feels like a celebrity moment for me to be able to have all of you in a Zoom together. So thank you so much. And for this final portion of our program, I'd like to bring Dasha Leeds into the room to moderate our Q&A discussion. Mr. Leeds is the conservation organizer for the Sierra Club Loma Prieta chapter. He has been an advocate for dark sky policies for 4 years and really helped push for the city of Cupertino's now adopted dark sky ordinance. We have quite a few audience questions already, but feel free to continue asking them in the Q&A section of Zoom. If we don't get to all the questions, we will try to get some written answers from our speakers that we'll send out in a follow-up email. So I will turn it over to you, Mr. Leeds. Take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Annie. We've got a lot of questions here, so I'm just going to get started. The first question will be directed to all of the panelists, so anyone feel free to hop into this one. This question comes from Pat Peralta, who asks, is the issue of light pollution part of the overall global environment and climate change discussion?
Yes, Pat, in short, it is. We're in a little bit different situation than we would have been a few years ago because of how much LED light there is out there in the world now. In the old days, outdoor lighting was a lot less energy efficient than it is now, and we could draw a more direct line to influences like climate change. But even that being said, and I kind of implied earlier in my talk that LED lighting was part of this problem, and by making it cheaper to consume light, it's prompting people to consume more, and it's possible that the environmental benefits have really been undercut because of the overconsumption of light. So I would say any opportunity we have to save on energy use by reducing our consumption of light at night, no matter what the type of light, no matter where we get our energy from, it's going to be better for the environment, and it will be better in reducing climate change.
Awesome, thank you. We'll move on to our next question. This question is directed specifically for Dr. Longcore. This comes from Allison Hicks. Can you comment on the effects of night light on human health? I find that information is an additional motivator for policymakers and potential community advocates. I was personally told by my health provider to sleep in complete dark to prevent the recurrence of hormonally activated breast cancer.
Yeah, so that's a whole nother, hour talk. So we have circadian rhythms just like every other species pretty much on the planet, and disrupting them has adverse consequences. Some of the ones that we know the best do in fact have to do with hormonal cancers like breast cancer. And that's, we know this both from a epidemiological perspective, meaning we have large populations of people who don't get to sleep during the nighttime hours in the form of shift workers, and we demonstrate higher cancer rates with them. We have studies showing a statistical association between satellite measured light at night and adverse health outcomes, including sleep, which has a whole series of cascading health impacts from it. That includes studies like when we came out just this year, something of the California teachers study, where we looked at the effects of light at night, air quality, noise, anthropogenic noise, and access to green space all together. And even when you account for all those other things, there is still a significant signal in terms of sleep quality for people who are in areas that have excess higher levels of light at night. And so we also know, in terms of the cancer, the mechanism, the presumed mechanism, which is the suppression of the production of melatonin, which is the hormone that we produce in the dark, and have shown that breast cancer tumors that are basically grafted onto laboratory mice and perfused with blood from either women who are exposed to light at night or not. The ones exposed to light at night have low melatonin levels. Those tumors grow. The ones that don't have light at night have high melatonin levels, and it keeps the tumors from growing. So melatonin is called an oncostatic hormone. It keeps cancers from growing. You may have an incipient tumor, but it doesn't go anywhere if you've got the right amount of melatonin. There are those who still would argue we don't have the smoking gun to conclusively prove that the way in which light is affecting health. But then again, it's incredibly difficult to get that, just the way it's incredibly difficult to get it for smoking and cancer. At a certain point, when the epidemiological literature is consistent with the laboratory mechanistic studies, you kind of take the precautionary approach and try to reduce the light at night for human health reasons as well. So there's plenty of research out there. That's just the tiniest little introduction from a geographer who's taught himself epidemiology as a side benefit of working on light at night.
Awesome. Thank you for that answer, Dr. Longcore. We'll move on to our next question here. And by the way, even though I may address future questions to specific panelists, if anyone else has answers for this question, feel free to raise your hand and hop in also. So this is just a general question for all panelists. This is a combined question. It comes from Ann Schneider and several others in the chat here, which is, what are your top recommended policy solutions for curbing light pollution? For example, are these resources available for specific directions or language for general plans, specific plans, or ordinances? And before I send this question out to everyone, I'll actually hop in and say that Cupertino has a really excellent combined bird safe design and dark sky ordinance. And I will now put the question to the panelists.
Well, I would suggest to Ann and the others that there's a few things that you can put into any sort of a policy, whether it's a public policy like the lighting ordinance, or a corporate policy for a campus, or a school district, which are often independent of their municipalities. There are very few basic lighting technical details that could be addressed in an ordinance. And Travis had a slide that showed a number of those about, lighting only what you need, in only the right amount, et cetera. And there are some simple ways to write those into policies that are quite effective if you have the will of the organization or the municipality or the voters behind it to actually implement those changes. And there are a few other things. We try to prevent what we call overlighting, which is just putting too much light on one location. And so we can specify that in a couple of different ways. Lighting curfews, to where you say that after a certain hour of night, most lighting has to be either dimmed or completely extinguished. That can be very effective. And in my presentation, I noted that we can do this through a zoning process as well, which works out really well where people have tried it, to where you give people a little bit more allowance of light where there's more expected human activity at night. But you also, at the other end of the scale, you can have zones where lighting isn't allowed at all if there's no expected human presence. So those are the sort of core ideas that go into a lot of the kind of lighting policies that we try to get enacted at different levels here in this country. There's certainly people taking interesting approaches above and beyond that, but I think any community or company that wanted to look at those basic ideas would really be doing a good service if they did.
Mary, you got anything to add?
I have long looked to Dr. Barentine for all of the recommendations in terms of lighting ordinances and recommendations. So I think I'll leave it to his expertise. Yeah.
Okay, I will move on to our next question. This question is directed at Ms. Coolidge. We've received several questions on architecture. And so how do we approach architectural design for schools or institutes? And how do we educate professional architecture organizations?
Yeah, I guess I'll start by saying everything I've learned about talking to architects, I've learned from Dr. Shepard. So American Bird Conservancy has a fairly standardized presentation that has been made eligible for continuing ed credit for AIA registered architects. And that's something that I have also shared with architects relatively locally, though I've done some at a distance as well. So I think first of all, the idea would be to get registered to be able to provide that kind of training if you're interested and qualified. Otherwise, directing architecture firms to folks who are prepared to give those kinds of presentations. And I do a fair bit of emphasis in my presentations on the relationship between artificial light at night and collisions. Though most of the collisions that we see in this area happen during the day, they're not catastrophic at night collisions. Nevertheless, light is still playing a role in birds hitting windows. So one thing is that AIA registered class that can be offered. Another thing is that there are some architects that are not registered with AIA, but they still have to have state credentials. And so they are also required to keep up with a certain amount of continuing ed credits. So they can take the class as well and be eligible for a certificate. And then in terms of getting into architecture offices, I mean, I cold call a lot of architecture firms. I do it less and less because now I have relationships with so many local architects. And in those cases, folks start coming to me, particularly if they have a client who's interested in designing to bird safe specs, or if they've put up a building that has problems. And I see that a lot, particularly in schools. A lot of schools are really interested in daylighting their buildings, and that's fantastic. But plenty of kids have a lot of trauma in their lives, and birds hitting windows is not helping. So we do a lot of retrofit consultations with architects and even, building occupants where they end up having a collision problem. So I don't know, Dr. Shepard, do you want to add anything to that?
I think you covered it pretty well. I mean, there are architectural conventions that, you can speak at. We try pretty much any way we can to reach as large an audience of architects as we can get to.
Awesome. All right. We'll go on to our next question here. This one is directed to Dr. Barentine. This is sort of a dual question here. First part is, it sounds like the problem isn't just LED lighting, but that the cost of LED lighting has decreased and become more efficient, and that the solution is better design, legislation, and awareness. Is that correct? So part one. And then part two is there a cost difference between LED fixtures that provide responsible lighting and those that are creating the light pollution?
Those are both great questions, and I'm especially glad for the first one. It's absolutely the case. When I said that LED is making the problem worse, that is true. And what I failed to mention was to follow that up by saying it remains my belief that if LED lighting were done well, it could save the planet. Not only does it have the characteristics with the high energy efficiency, but for example, that light is very directional. Unlike old sources where the light was sort of emitted more or less in all directions and we had to use optics and reflectors to try to shape the light as it emerged from a fixture. But LED has this exquisite level of control. It's not used very much, but if we were to use that, we could very carefully craft exactly where we wanted that light to go. LED is dimmable. Earlier technologies that were used for wide area lighting did not have that capability. You couldn't really drop the light down below a certain level without actually changing the fixture or changing the brightness of the lamp. And so you can turn it off and you can turn it back on. You can modify the spectrum that it emits. It has a lot of great qualities. What's missing is the sensitivity in enough lighting designers out there who are using it to know that it has this controllability and then to apply those controls in a way that results in reducing light. We think, and we have evidence to back this, that when people adopt these ideas of, use the light only where it's needed and in the right quantity and the right timing, if people did that, they would find that they needed a lot less light to do the job. And if that's true, then we could naturally bring down the amount of light in the nighttime environment over time, and the public wouldn't even know that they had done it because it's so well controlled. So that's absolutely true, that it's a matter of the right design, the right regulation, the right application of that light to get us to where we want to be. To the second question, at this point in time, there's really no cost penalty on the commercial lighting market if you choose products that are what we would generally describe as dark sky friendly. So they're fully shielded, they're not emitting light up into the night sky, they have the right color temperature that Travis talked about. It used to be that you paid more for those features because there wasn't as much of a demand for them on the market. But I would say that due to the efforts of lots of people in this world of dark skies and light pollution over the past decade, that's really starting to drive the demand for better lighting products. Those are mostly standard offerings now for most lighting manufacturers. If you go and buy a street light, if your municipality is going to change out its old lights for new ones, you kind of have to go out of your way to find a bad product now. That's a good thing. So the short answer is no, you don't pay more in order to make the right decision as we see it for protecting dark skies. The issue is the awareness so that people know to ask those questions and to choose the right products.
All righty, thank you. We'll go on to our next question. This one's directed at Dr. Shepard. In situations where clear glass allows birds to see completely through a wall or a building, how effective are bird-friendly glazing treatments in reducing collisions?
Oh, in that kind of situation, bird-friendly glass can do an excellent job. Obviously, you want the bird-friendly glass to be on both panels, whether they're parallel or meeting. In some cases, like building connectors, it's actually an opportunity. It means that you could use, you don't have to use a bespoke glass. You could actually use something like a window film because you can see through. You're not so worried about the reflection. So we've got products for every situation.
All righty, thank you. Moving on to our next question. This one is for Dr. Barentine. This comes from Alan Kaiser. He asks, is there any data and information on the difference between perceived safety at night versus actual safety at night due to artificial light? Also, would it be beneficial, it would be beneficial to educate and communicate with major cities, police chiefs, organizations, and associations. Maybe they have been concerned with glare causing auto and pedestrian accidents.
Yeah, good question, Alan. I don't know that there are studies that directly make that comparison between perceptions of safety and actual safety. They generally tend to be treated differently, but in cases where there have been studies in the same general area, in the same city, for example, if they are constructed carefully, we could start to make some comparisons. I should mention that a lot of these studies, first of all, it's difficult to get them funded. Second, especially where anything having to do with crime during the overnight hours, it's very difficult to get useful information out of the data and to put together really meaningful studies. So there's a lot of ambiguity in the literature that's out there. As far as I can tell from what I have looked at, there's not a huge correspondence between the perception of safety and actual safety. A lot of people have in mind that a brighter outdoor space is safer at night. I showed the example from the study done in Israel where you get a really big boost in a perception of safety when you go from no light to a fairly dimly lit space. And you keep getting those feelings increasing as you go to higher light levels, but it flattens out very quickly. So if you light a space up like day, you don't get the same perception on the part of people that are out there than if you're lighting to a fraction of that. As far as whether that yields actual safety, whether it's crime or traffic safety, for example, it really depends on the circumstances. There are instances where we see definite improvements when we add light. There are cases where we see decreases, where things are going the wrong direction because light has been added, or there is too much light. The classic example is if you overlight a parking lot, and there is a tendency to do this because people are afraid going to and from their cars at night. you end up creating shadows between the cars. And if you're worried about your personal safety at night, not only is it hard to see obstacles in those shadows, but then you're also giving a potential criminal perpetrator a place to hang out and wait for you, essentially. So you can go too far in the other direction and create these other externalities that are not helpful to the situation. And I agree, we need to do more outreach with law enforcement organizations, especially because there still is a pervasive sense in law enforcement that the closer you are to daylight at night, the safer things are, the more secure they are. Even the majority of crimes happen during the daylight hours. And so there's an education that can be done there to improve that situation. And also, I've talked to plenty of people in law enforcement who actually do fundamentally get it, and they will bring up examples like light sources that yield a lot of glare that makes it difficult for them to do their jobs. So we should be using these great characteristics of lighting when it's done properly to make the world an actually safer place at night, rather than just trying to reassure ourselves that simply because the world is brighter that we're going to be safer existing in it.
Yeah, John, maybe I can add a thing or two on top of that, which is one, on the glare issue. I helped the consultant team that wrote the new streetlight master plan for Salt Lake City, and part of that process was outreach and meetings with all the city agencies and interest groups and whatnot. And police and fire were very much interested in getting the newer LEDs that were very blue, glaring, toned down because it was blowing out their cameras. Now that means that you're bought into the whole surveillance state. We can talk about that another time, but the police were actually, interested in better, higher quality lighting because they were finding that the new lights were rendering some of their existing resources inoperable. That's one thing. Second is this issue of perception versus actual safety. There are some paradoxes that happen here as well. Along roads, people who think that they're well lit and would be seen by oncoming cars act in ways that are less safe than people who feel like it's dark and that they won't be seen by the oncoming cars. And so sometimes when you give people light and they get a false sense of safety, that then leads to behaviors that end up in more accidents. Third thing is about the roadway issue. We do have some studies out there, and you might hear them cited if you're involved in this field, about color temperature and ability to see roadway obstructions, and arguing that a higher color temperature, one with more blue, sort of white, colder white color with more blue in it, allows you to see an obstruction farther away on the roadway at 4,000 Kelvin color temperature versus 3,000 or 2,700. And they've done this study in a number of different cities. And I was really curious about this, so I pulled it together and I looked at these detection distances across all of the cities, and it turns out there was a bigger difference in the detection distance between the cities than there was between the color temperatures within the cities. And so there's more going on here than just the top line research that has maybe been, and I know the guys who've done this research, so I'm not trying to trash talk them, but I think they probably agree. We need to do a better job of connecting actual changes in lighting to actual accidents on the road before we go policy-wise, because there are some things that we do know, right? Lighting an intersection it reduces accidents relative to not lighting the intersection. But fascinating fact, if you take an intersection, it's a rural intersection, North Dakota, middle of nowhere, two roads come together, that kind of an intersection. If you just put a stoplight there and no street lighting, you reduce the accidents far, far, far more than by illuminating it. So sometimes the choice that is given to us is between you either light this up bright, to standards, or you don't light at all, when there may be actually a third choice that's safer, that actually produces less adverse consequences in terms of light pollution. So this is an area, luckily, and I think John would agree because he's on some of these committees too, where we're finally at a point internationally now where the roadway safety people and the light pollution folks and sometimes the medical circadian rhythm researchers and whatnot, we're all finally getting on the same committees in the same room to hash these things out together. Whereas in the past, the roadway lighting recommendations from the the Illuminating Engineering Society, for example. It was in John's presentation, is like, these are not science-based recommendations, because the process to make those recommendations was the people on the committee had to come to unanimous consent about what the standard was going to be. So any one person on the committee, who could be Joe, and it usually was a Joe, lighting guy from Nebraska, or wherever it might be, nothing against Nebraska, just using us at random state, could say, no, I think it should be brighter. And if he held firm, the recommendations ultimately would say what they said. It didn't have to be connected to any scientific finding whatsoever. So we're in the beginning stages, I believe, of an overhaul of these kinds of regulations, so that scientists, biologists, traffic safety are in the room and trying to make sure that these recommendations are at least science-based, and not simply, these are the 10 people around the country who work in lighting and they think this is how bright your road should be. Sorry, IES, to undermine your previous processes, but that's literally how it worked.
All right, thank you. We'll go on to the next question here. This one is for Dr. Shepard. Where can we source bird-friendly glass for home projects? For example, Ornolux has great UV reflective patterns on glass, but they're in Europe, and it's unclear to me how to actually get, say, triple pane windows. It's unclear to me how to actually get, say, triple pane windows, which incorporate this glass for homes in California and Colorado.
Yeah, at this point, it's very difficult to get bird-friendly glass in home windows, and it's always a custom job, and it always costs a lot. In many ways, it's actually more effective to use a retrofit to design your house to incorporate one of the solutions that you can put on existing glass. So, you know, you can use anything from external solar shading to, if you know what an Acopian bird saver is, you can actually make them retractable. You don't necessarily need bird-friendly glass, and it tends to be manufactured, as you say, to go into insulated glass units. So it doesn't actually fit into the frames that are used for home windows. There is some interest at this point on the part of the glass industry in creating bird-friendly home windows, but I think it's going to be a while. Meanwhile, use external insect screens, you know, wherever you can.
Yeah, I'll just add to that and say that Dr. Shepard is right on the money. And I have had one experience where Audubon was renovating a property that we have up on Mount Hood, and I was insisting that the windows be bird friendly. And what we ended up having to do was source the glass from Glass Pro, which is a glass manufacturer in California that does make a UV product. And we sourced the frames from Geldwin, a residential window maker, and we had a third party put them together. It was actually less expensive than buying the high-end residential windows that they had originally spec'd for the property. So it can be done, but it definitely took a lot of footwork to put together the glass from Glass Pro, the frames from Geldwin, and then a third party that would put them together for us and install them. So
And
it is an option.
Yeah, UV glass isn't going to work for things like pigeons and doves, raptors. So especially if you want bird-friendly windows because you're building a home, you know, in a wooded area, you're better off finding something that's going to be more effective, even though it's a retrofit.
Awesome, thank you. We'll go on to the next question here. This one is to all panelists. This one is from Janet McIntosh, who asks, how about any specific film recommendations for films we can recommend for our local annual Social Justice Film Festival?
Oh yeah, I threw one suggestion in the chat for that. There's a film called Saving the Dark by Sriram Murali, who is an East Indian filmmaker. It's a really beautiful film. It was made, 7 years ago now, so it's not fresh. It's not hot off the press, but it's a great film. And he's generally very generous about sharing the rights to it so that you could show it at a film festival for free.
Okay, awesome. Moving on to our next question. This one is for Dr. Barentine from Ann Schneider again. And the question is, how can smaller cities work together, reducing costs by quantity and spreading out staff time? A checklist and best practices would be great.
That's an interesting question, Ann. I haven't found a lot of cooperation in a regional sense. I think it's still kind of early for that. But the notion of pooling resources is an important one, given that if you want to do a serious update of your municipal lighting, that's still a big upfront capital cost for a lot of smaller cities and towns. And that they might, especially if they were served by a utility or a co-op that installs and manages the lights, they might have a little bit better sort of collective bargaining power, if you will, if they got together in order to do that. But I'm not sure I can point to a specific example as a sort of a best practice, because it's just been a very unusual thing up to this point in time.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is going to be for Ms. Coolidge. What have been the most challenging aspects of your advocacy work? Where have you faced the most resistance? And what would you recommend for a new advocate starting out in this field?
I think that one of the most challenging things in my mind in our time is the perception of crime and lighting. And it's fairly intractable. I can tell you that my partner's car was stolen from right in front of our house, directly under a streetlight. Her catalytic converter was stolen from the car directly under the streetlight. We don't live in a bad neighborhood. It's just the current condition of some of our cities, or at least of Portland. And so crime has really shot up, and I think that people are using light as a hopeful means of reducing crime. The other thing that I really see happening is that jurisdictions are using light a lot to deter unhoused folks from hanging around or camping. And at least where that is concerned, and frankly, from the crime standpoint as well, the solutions have to be so much more thoughtful and nuanced and multifold, rather than just this idea that if we shine a giant light on something, we won't have more houseless people and we won't have crime. So I think that that's one of the hardest things. And, I really do think that this issue of perception is so important, because, in many cases, we believe what we're told. There are so many ways in which there's kind of the status quo of group thinking, and we perpetuate that. And there's this idea that more light equals less crime. And I think that we have to figure out how we can start to shift that general thinking. I know I lead birding trips, and if you tell people they're having a great time and they've seen all kinds of great birds, they feel like they're having a great time and have seen all kinds of great birds. And if you tell people they're having a crappy time and we've missed all the good birds, that's exactly how they feel. It's astonishing to me how much you can really influence the way that people feel about things just by speaking with authority. So I think, there's this issue of talking with law enforcement that Dr. Barentine brought up. And I think that's a really important place that we need to spend some time and energy, is thinking about how we can start changing some of this overall messaging. I think there was a second part of that question that was maybe about advice for advocates. And I think I would just say, to build your relationships thoughtfully, make them go into relationships intending to have them for a long time. And, make sure you're really building a pretty diverse coalition of folks who are working with you, because it's going to take every different direction of coming at this, I think, to really start to make a lot of change.
Cool. All right, I will move on to the next question. We've received several questions about specific types of lighting installations, and this is for all panelists, by the way. Questions about holiday lighting, art lighting, stadiums, rail stations, airports, and billboards. Do you know whether there are regulations that address these diverse types of lighting already?
I can say that there are spot examples in particular codes in different parts of the country that will address those. A lot of cities, if they have a lighting ordinance, for example, they probably have something about holiday lighting. Putting some boundaries on the calendar dates when it can be up, and either allowing or prohibiting certain kinds of lighting. There are fewer examples for other very specific applications. You might see flagpoles as a type of lighting that's specified in an ordinance. You might see distinctions made between commercial and industrial type zoned uses versus residential, and they might get different allowances for different sorts of applications. String lighting. So outside of the holiday period, you'll see where, for example, restaurants with outdoor seating areas like to have the string lights for some ambient lighting. And we really don't have a lot of good examples for how to regulate that. Sports facilities, the International Dark Sky Association publishes some guidelines for doing sports lighting as well as you can in a way that's sort of dark sky friendly that some communities are slowly beginning to take up. So it really depends. You can take any kind of application, no matter what it is, and you can apply these general principles that we've been talking about so far. But it is true that the way you get into the particulars of a sports stadium is different than you would for holiday lighting, and we're still figuring this out as we go along. One thing that I will add on to what Mary said about building your coalitions that relates to this is pick your battles. I advise communities that are writing holiday lighting restrictions into their codes that don't already have them to not be the Grinch that stole Christmas, because no one likes that person, right? Probably in the big scheme of things, holiday lights are not that big of a deal in terms of light pollution, and people like them. And when you try to take them away, people get upset about that. To be honest, I'm a lot more worried about the floodlights on the side of a building that are running all night long, every night of the year, or the parking lot lights that are on at 3 o'clock in the morning when no one's parked there. That's what I'm going to go after before I'm going to go after holiday lighting. And your coalitions will appreciate that. You have to remember there's a human dimension to what we're trying to accomplish here. And we can't just go in and say, well, we're the experts and we know what's best for you, because we know how that tends to go. We need to build the coalitions, get people on board with these ideas, bring them to the point that they want things to be different. And then when they're ready to make changes, we're there to advise them on what the right things are to do.
I was just going to say, we could get in, if people were interested, there are weeds on all these things, right? There's a new recommended practice for digital billboards that limits, but it's not a regulation, it's a recommended practice from the IES that limits the total amount of light per square meter, basically, that they're allowed to emit if you want to comply with the recommended practice. And you could, if it's less than what you've got going on in your local area, you can make that argument, and you might be able to point to those documents from the IES that are better than what you're currently getting. The thing with stadium and sports lighting, they can't, when they're on, they're a huge contributor to overall sky glow, huge. And the keys, when I get calls from people saying they're proposing lights in my town and blah blah blah, it's like, okay, the human dimension, right? Is this going to happen? If it's going to happen, how do you figure out how to make it the least worst it can be? And so here are the things you need to think about. Writing curfews into the actual permitting, enforceable curfews, like it's never going to be on after 10 o'clock at night. They get 10 nights during football season, and that's it. Whatever it is, the limiting that duration. Second is making sure that they've gone for and gotten the best shielded lights possible. And there are companies that really, really specialize in getting that light on the field where it needs to go and not elsewhere, and not spill. That's another thing to make sure that you can do. The other one is the color temperature, how much blue it is, because the more blue it is, the more it's going to scatter, the more sky glow. There are different ratings for levels of play that require different color temperatures. And so if you're going to be like broadcast on TV, you need a certain color temperature. But if you're playing, non-TV broadcast, rec ball, it's a completely different thing. And making sure they're not designing to a higher sports field lighting standard than it's actually going to be used for. And then the other one is never believe anybody when they says an installation is going to be temporary. Make them make them get the permits from the start. It is never temporary. It always gets converted to permanent once it's up. And so sorry, that was my inner activist coming out on that one a little bit. Yeah, and some things, art, right? How did this all get started? How did that book and the conference get started back in 2002? Well, we got galvanized by an art project at the Port of Los Angeles that would have taken what was it, 11 7,000 watt xenon sky tracker floodlights and pointed them straight up into the sky 24, every night, all night. And we got together and with a fancy artist who was saying that this was art and this was for the community and it was a gateway to Los Angeles, and built a coalition with Catherine, Rich, and I, with the astronomers, our local, astronomical community, with some ecologists, with very, when it wasn't really put together, and people ultimately in the neighborhood who had been passing the hat to save their pennies to light this bridge. But all they'd asked for was little tracer lights to go across the bridge. They didn't want a big art project that was going to be done by some highfalutin artist who, parachuted in from somewhere else. They just wanted little tracer lights on their bridge. And so ultimately, by the time we were done, coalitions, we got the California Coastal Commission to say, no, that's a significant adverse impact on coastal zone resources. And when they redesigned, we supported them when they said, oh, can we just do tracer lights like the community's been asking for and putting on their visualizations all this time? We're like, yes, let's do that, because it, that coalition was going to stand, right? And it respected the local community, because they knew about light pollution, because they are next to the port, which is just chronic light pollution, except it's coming at their neighborhoods and at their windows instead of shooting straight up into the sky. So we were able to reinforce their feelings about their own environment and the things that really are dumped on them as a port community, and allow them to have the beautification that they wanted. So every one of these things has nuances.
Okay, all right. We are running close to the end of our time here. So I think we're going to have one last question to wrap up our Q&A session. This is sort of a general one to all panelists, which is in about 1 minute or so, do you have any closing thoughts for everyone here today?
Everyone can make a difference. There is no act that is too small or too insignificant. And I think it's only by that collection of small acts that will add up to bigger acts that will eventually solve this problem. And I feel good about the prospects.
I completely agree.
Can we all just second what John said? Yeah.
Well, it's important to do something. And if you can get yourself to do something, you're more likely to do it again. And if you can work with people and get them to do just one small thing, any kind of commitment will get people, down that trail, and will get them to be more likely to be sympathetic to the next thing. So it's just really important. You think what I do can't be important, but it is.
The great thing for me about this topic is, even though we've got the crime issue to kind of deal with a little bit, in general, people intuitively get it that shining light on things that are supposed to be in the dark is kind of bad for them. People get it when there's a light that shines in their window when they're trying to sleep. They understand it if you phrase it that way for other wildlife. And you can work with that intuitive empathy and make progress. And yeah, we've all got a long way to go, but we can make progress.
Yeah, I would sort of piggyback on that and say, keep envisioning the world you want to live in and keep working towards it. And, I think a lot of people that haven't engaged with their local legislators don't know how impactful it can be to engage and, to speak up and to write a letter or attend a hearing. And it really makes a huge difference. I mean, so many people don't participate that your participation absolutely counts. So get out there, show up for action alerts, talk to your legislators, think about what you can do to live in the world you want to live in.
Awesome. Thank you so much to all of our panelists for answering questions. And thanks to everyone who sent in questions. And thanks to Shawnee and Ronnie who helped filter those in for us. I'll pass it on now to Annie.
Great, thank you so much. This brings us to the end of our program today, Light at Night, a Glowing Hazard. Thank you so much to Assemblymember Lee, to our wonderful speakers today, Dr. Longcore, Ms. Coolidge, Dr. Barentine, and Dr. Shepard, and Mr. Leeds. Thanks for moderating. Thank you all to the organizations who support our symposium, and thank you to you, our audience members, for sticking with us for the last few hours. We hoped you learned more about the harmful effects of light at night and have taken away some strategies to mitigate this problem. And we hope we've inspired you and motivated you to go out and advocate for dark skies. So on behalf of the Santa Clara Valley Audubon Society and the Sierra Club Loma Prieta chapter and the Bay Alive campaign, we hope you will join us to make the Bay Area safer for wildlife and the environment and for us as residents. Thank you and have a good rest of your afternoon.